What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, we dive into the best decks currently in Standard best of 3. Each of these decks bring something kind of unique to the table, especially for someone who plays tabletop and also does play Arena and kind of likes the more traditional style of Magic. Each of these decks do contain a sideboard, though I would say sideboards are always subjective just because it depends on what the metagame is. But I believe each of these decks do have a pretty decent sideboard to kind of give you a general idea for a general metagame if you're unsure of where to start. With that being said, each of these decks are pretty good overall. Some of these decks are decks you may have seen here on the channel before on maybe another metagame list for best of 1, but these are a little bit different as these are more tuned for playing 3 games at Magic compared to the typical, let me just get the most aggressive best deck in best of 1. With that being said, let's just dive into the first deck and let's just start talking about it. So the first deck up here on the list is going to be Esper Legends. Now this is a deck that I've shown off here on the channel, but this is definitely a deck that performs very well in a standard best of 3 metagame as well, just because there are a lot of powerful cards. A lot of these cards are very proactive, meaning that they have abilities that when they come into the battlefield, they do some sort of trigger or some sort of effect, or maybe when they attack or leave the battlefield, they also have some sort of additional trigger and or effect. This is definitely a list I've shown here on the channel before. Maybe you are familiar with it already, though we do get some new cards in this deck for Brothers War being added into the meta, and those cards being Grixis the Yawgmoth Predator, a 3-drop 3/3, that whenever a creature we control deals damage to one of our opponents, its controller may pay 1 life. If we do, we get to draw a card, and then depending how many creatures we have that dealt damage, we could pay that life X amount of times, so we could draw possibly 1 card, 2 cards, 3 cards, and so on. And then for 7 mana, we discard X cards, exile the top X cards of opponent's library, and we can play lands and cast spells from among them, exile this way without paying their mana cost, which is definitely not that bad as well if we're looking for ways to kind of grind our opponent out in the late game. Other than that, we also have Ashnod the Flesh Mechanist, a 1-drop 1/1 with Death Touch, which is definitely very strong already. Whenever it attacks, we can sacrifice another creature. If we do, we create a tap Power Stone token, which we then can use to ramp up to cast certain effects and or abilities on creatures that we have, like its own ability that we can pay 5 mana, exile a creature card from graveyard, create a tap 3/3 colors zombie artifact token. This can be done at any time, so if we have the open mana, we can just do it at the end of our opponent's turn, get a 3/3 zombie ready to attack, and the idea of possibly creating tap Power Stone tokens may also be pretty decent. Then in the 2-drop slot, we do have Harbin, the Vanguard Aviator. This is kind of a unique card. It doesn't seem like it has a very good place in the deck, but it definitely works because it itself is a legend. And it's a pretty strong 2-drop, just it being a 2-drop 3/2 with flying, that whenever we attack 5 more soldiers, creatures we control get +1/+1 and flying. We don't play a ton of soldiers in the deck, so it's more than likely we're never going to hit the other ability, but I do think it's a pretty decent aggressive 3/2 for 2, which definitely works well with things like Plaza of Heroes, meaning that it's just another thing that we can target with Plaza of Heroes, or it helps us tap mana for mana of colors based on legendary permanents we control, which is definitely very good. Other than that, this is kind of the same old Esper Legends deck that you may have seen for the most part. I do think the one thing I will note that is a little bit more unique is probably the fact that we are playing a sideboard. So if you are someone who plays best of 1, typically you're not really using the sideboard. So I do think having a very viable sideboard, depending on what your meta is definitely very good. And I'll show you what the general sideboard of this deck is in case you're interested in if you're looking to play a best of 3 version of the deck. So the sideboard is pretty straightforward. I mean, it is one of those things we add in some Brutal Cathars if we need some additional removal. Itself is not a legend, which is not something that helps us, but yet again, it's still a very powerful card with it being a 3 mana 2/2 that exiles a creature until it leaves the battlefield, then flips over, it becomes night. Another card that we have in the sideboard is we have some Disdainful Strokes. Depending on what the meta is, if your opponent's playing very big expensive spells, Disdainful Stroke is a definitely solid add. 2 mana counter target spell that costs mana value 4 or less, or 4 or more, I should say. Shieldred is another card that we could add additional copy if we feel like we need to draw this card. If opponents maybe trying to do a lot of drawing effects, and it itself will also help us gain some life. This is definitely good against other aggressive matchups, as Shieldred is definitely a very hard target to get rid of because it is a 4/5. Additional copy of 1 Emperor is very good. Itself is a bit of removal. It can also pump one of our creatures, given it first strike. And then it itself can create tokens if we need to, if we're not drawing a bunch of creatures. We also have Radabek Urbog also in here for playing a deck that's maybe a little bit more heavier on the board removal. This is very good because it makes all our legendary creatures that when they die, they come back onto the battlefield as 2/2 zombies that aren't legendary. And then itself gives all our zombie creatures we control vigilance, which makes them very, hard to deal with. And it also has vigilance and ward of 2. Additional copies of Destroy Evil if they're playing a lot of enchantments or they're playing a lot of big creatures. This card's very good. We also have Unlicensed Hearse, just because if they have any reoccursion, it's also very good to have some sort of effect to kind of get rid of their reoccursion. Either it's on Earth cards, flashback cards, maybe cards that you're just hoping that they don't return back from the graveyard in general. And then as the more cards it gets underneath it, itself becomes a pretty relatively large creature. And if it ever leaves the battlefield, any cards that were exiled with it get exiled as they leave the battle, as this leaves the battlefield as well. So it's still, even if it's not going to be attacking as a creature, it just eats graveyards and just gets rid of those cards for the rest of the game, making this an overall pretty solid option, I would say, if you're looking for something that is similar to what you are playing when it comes to something maybe you're familiar with when it comes to Esper Legends. The next deck up on the list is Azorius Soldiers. Now, this is relatively a newish deck, but I have covered a version of this deck in prior videos here on the channel. It uses blue and white and a lot of the new cards from Brothers War, as well as some other cards that have existed in the meta overall. This is probably the more grindier of the two versions, as the mono white version is a little bit more on the aggressive side. This is a little bit of, we're going to build up a board state and we're going to kind of draw a bunch of cards and get a bunch of additional value and kind of overwhelm our opponent in that sense. It has a lot of new cards in it from Brothers War, one of them being Yodian Frontliner, 1 mana 1/1, that whenever it attacks, target creature control gets also +1/+1 at end of turn. And then we can unearth it from the battlefield for 1 white mana, making this an overall pretty good, effective soldier for 1 mana. Recruitment Officer is another 1-drop in the deck. It's a 1 mana 2/1. Solid option there. Pretty powerful even for 1 mana for having a 2-power creature. On top of that, we can tap 4 mana, reveal top 4 cards of our library. You can reveal a creature card with mana value 3 or less among them, put into our hand, and put the rest in the bottom of our library in any random order. Meaning that we can either do it on our turn if we really need something, or at the end of our opponent's turn, if we just want to kind of get a creature into our hand, possibly without them having to remove it with some sort of hand removal kind of thing like that. Resolute Reinforcements, just trying to get aggressive creatures out on the battlefield. Also, because we are playing blue, it may, if there's any possibility that you have blue mana and white mana, they may think you're some sort of maybe Azorius control deck. You can kind of catch your opponent by surprise, make them think that you have a counterspell, but in reality, it's a Resolute Reinforcements. Thalia is also in here. Valiant Veterans in here as the lord of our soldier deck, making all our other soldiers additional +1/+1. We have Harbin in this deck. This deck makes more sense for it because itself is a 3/2 legendary human soldier. And then this deck can get a lot of creatures on the battlefield pretty quickly. And then if we can attack with 5 or more, we get them all flying and the additional +1/+1. In the 3-drop slot, we have Brutal Cathar because it's a strong removal card built into a creature. We have Siege Veteran here because it's like a Luminarch Aspirant in the sense that it gives +1/+1 at the beginning of our combat, and we get to put that counter on target creature we control. And then whenever another non-soldier we control dies, we get to create a colorless soldier creature token, meaning that we get a soldier to replace a soldier in case we lose a soldier. We have In the Trenches here as kind of like a Glorious Anthem type effect. A 3 mana, giving creatures we control +1/+1. Makes it very good, especially a lot of our creatures being not that large. And then for 6 mana, we can exile target non-land permanent we don't control until this leaves the battlefield, and we can only activate the sorcery and only once, so we only get 1 removal, but it's built into a thing that we already have on the battlefield, which is definitely not that bad. Sky Strike Officer is another card that's in the deck at 3 mana 2/3 with flying, that whenever it attacks, we can create a 1/1 soldier creature token, and then we can tap on 3 untapped soldiers we control and draw a card, which is kind of like the big thing in the deck. This is going to allow us to dig deeper into the deck pretty efficiently overall. Other than that, I mean, nothing too crazy else is in the deck. Mana base is pretty Azorius. We do have Fortified Beachhead, which is the new Azorius colored land, but for soldiers, if we reveal a soldier, it comes to the battlefield untap. If we don't, it becomes in the battlefield tap. It creates blue and white mana without the cost of life. And then for 5 mana, we can actually pump our soldiers we control +1/+1 to end a turn. And we also have Mishra Foundry, just another creature in the land in the deck, just in case if our opponent has some sort of board wipes, you can still put pressure on them with a Mishra's Foundry as we rebuild overall, or make it a pretty decent blocker, and as well maybe catch our opponent off guard if they're not paying attention. But this is kind of like, one of those things, like aggro is still pretty good, but you do have to have some sort of way to grind games out. When it comes to sideboard, we're going to dive in and kind of check that out. So sideboard is pretty straightforward. I mean, it's very heavy on the white. There really isn't too many blue cards that we're going to really want to add into the deck. One card being Guardian New Benalia. This is another great card. If our opponent's very heavy on the spot removal, New Benalia is very good in the sense that it's going to be one of those cards that we can discard cards to protect, and then it gets indestructible at a turn. We got Anointed Peacekeeper. If our opponent's build more on the control side, we get Anointed Peacekeeper out, and we start taxing cards in their hand or in their deck. Wandering Emperor, if they're also aggressive, we can also use this card to exile their creatures whenever they attack, especially if, against a matchup where you have things that are maybe reoccurring, like a Tenacious Underdog or something, this card's really good to get rid of things like that. Unlicensed Hearse is yet again another great card in case your opponent has any sort of cards that reoccur from the graveyard. Unlicensed Hearse is always a good option to add it back into the deck when you sideboard, just because it's going to allow us to remove those cards from the game until, I guess until the next game, essentially. We also have Lauren Third Path, another unique card in the sense that it's a 3/2 Artificer with Vigilance that when it enters the battlefield, we destroy up to one target artifact or enchantment. And the upside, it's a 2/1 for 3 that has Vigilance, so it doesn't tap to attack. And then we can tap it, and you and target opponent each draw a card, which is not really a great effect because you and your opponent are going to draw a card, but it's definitely something that does give the deck a little bit more card advantage in case you need it, as well as a little bit of artifact and enchantment removal in case you need that as well. And then the last card that's added into the deck is Kyla's Reconstruction. This is an interesting card in the sense that we tap 3 white mana, look at the top 7 cards of our library, put X artifact and/or creature cards of mana value 3 or less among them onto the battlefield, and put the rest of them on our library in any random order. So our deck is essentially just creatures and lands, so depending on how much we tap for X, we could put a chunk of cards just right back on the battlefield. Yet again, another great card to have in the deck post sideboard in case your opponent's playing heavy board removal and or spot removal. This definitely helps us rebuild really, really quickly for relatively decent mana when it comes to cost. Now, the next deck up on the list is kind of a deck that's kind of existed in best of one since its inception, and I think it's been pretty prominent in traditional Magic as well, this being probably the most approachable when it comes to being a standard deck that you can get into when it comes to overall cost, and that is Mono Blue Tempo. This deck is very good. It's one of those decks, it's like a control deck, and it just has only a couple things that really threaten your opponent's life total. If you haven't played this deck, those 2 cards being our Haughty Djinn as well as Tolarian Terror. Both these cards benefit us based on how many instants and sorceries have in the graveyard, and this one gets power greater based on how many instants of sorceries, and this one just costs less based on how many instants of sorceries, so making this overall pretty good for the amount of instants of sorceries we play in the deck and not as many creatures. Another thing with Haughty Djinn is the fact that it makes all our instants of sorceries cost 1 less, which is definitely very good when it comes to maybe countering what our opponent's doing. As you see here, we have a fair amount of 2 mana spells as well as 1 3 mana spell, and also 1 5 mana spell, which is definitely very good. Overall, this is definitely a unique deck in the sense that it is just very heavy. I'm going to counter your things. Its probably big weak point is the fact that if you don't counter something and you don't really have a good way to deal with said something, it's going to be hard for you to catch up just because we don't have a lot of, board presence outside of our 8 creatures, and the rest is all lands and creatures. So I would say that's probably the one thing to point out. This deck is a deck that relies on making sure you counter the key spells and not letting your opponent resolve anything that you can't deal with. Now, when it comes to sideboarding, just like everything else, this deck is going to, sideboard based on what the matchup is. If we need more non-creature counter magic, we'll add additional negates in. Surge Engine, if we want to be more aggressive. This is a great card for being a 2 mana 3/2 that we can pay mana to grow it, and the bigger we grow it, it makes it harder for our opponent to deal with. For 1 mana, make it so that it loses defender, gains unblockable. For 3 mana, it becomes a 5/4, and then for 6 mana, we can activate it once and draw 3 cards, which is definitely very good. Suspicious Stowaway is another great card if we want to get more tempo-y, meaning that we're aggressively tempo. So we get a creature that, for 1 mana, 1/1 that can't be blocked, and then whenever it deals damage to an opponent, we get to draw a card, they discard, or we discard a card. On the flip side, if it becomes nighttime, whenever it deals damage, we draw a card and don't have to discard a card, so definitely very good there. We have additional copies of Flow and Knowledge. This is definitely a very good card in the sense that it is a 5 mana, draw a card for each island we control. We play mono blue. We only play basics except for a couple of legendary lands. So we're going to be possibly drawing a bunch of cards and only have to discard 2 cards for that. Witness Protection, yet again, if there's just maybe our opponent's playing a bunch of things and we just need to have more interaction with creatures, this is definitely a very good card to have, making their creature just a 1/1 citizen essentially that loses all abilities and stuff like that. Then we have Python Needle here. Yet again, if our opponent's playing a lot of activated abilities, like Planeswalkers, we can Python Needle the Planeswalker, and then they can't play those activated abilities of said Planeswalker, or if they have a creature that has an activated ability, same thing, or artifact or anything like that, we name that card. It's definitely one of those cards that's definitely going to help us with that. Bankbuster's in here, just another good card that is a tap 2, draw a card, and then over time we can maybe eventually crew it, so it just gives us a little bit more ways to maybe put pressure on our opponent in the later game, but helping us keep the tempo going. with us either helping us to draw additional counter spells and or possibly additional ways to put pressure on our opponent in that sense. And then the last card up is Invoke the Winds. If our opponent's playing just a very big, heavy spell deck and we want, maybe they only play very select things as well, this card's going to allow us to gain control of target artifact or indoor creature and untap it, and then that's essentially ours. There's no if this leaves battlefield type thing. If it does die, it does go back to their graveyard, but other than that, it's ours until they get rid of it. So definitely another card that's key there, especially, like I said, with those decks that try to go over the top against you. So the next deck up here on the list is going to be Grixis Anvil. Now, this is a deck that kind of, as now with the release of Brothers War, has kind of started splashing blue. I also have done a version that splashes green for Jund. But this is definitely a deck that has existed. But like I said, we're adding some additional new cards from Brothers War that makes this deck a little bit on the better side, depending on what your preference is when it comes to the overall power. When it comes to Anvil decks, it is an Anvil deck, so the key card of the deck is only called Anvil. This is going to be one of those cards that's going to help us gain tokens on the battlefield, allowing us to do various other things with cards that are in the main deck of the deck. Another card that is new that got added is being the third path in Ironclad. It's 2 mana, 2/1, that whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we can create a 1/1 soldier creature token. That's an artifact, which is definitely very good. Yet again, creates tokens whenever we cast non-creature spells, allowing us to put pressure on our opponent in that way. If we get a bunch of tokens out, they may not be able to deal with it. Another card that's new in the deck that definitely is very good and possibly a reason why you want to splash blue is going to be Saheeli, Filigree Master. It's a 4 mana, 3 loyalty planeswalker that has a +1 ability that we can scry 1. May untap an artifact, may tap and untap artifact we control if we get to draw a card. So it's scry 1. Tap and untap artifact we control, whether it's a blood token, whether it's a treasure token, whether it's one of our token creatures. We have good ways to draw cards with her +1 ability. -2, we create 2 1/1 colors opted creature tokens of flying. They gain haste, so they can attack in immediately, which is definitely very good if we need to build up some tokens. And then -4, we get an emblem with artifact creatures we control get +1/+1, and artifact spells we cast cost 1 less to cast, making a lot of our artifact spells outside of Bankbuster cost that much less to cast. Really, it doesn't hit too many things in the deck if you really look at it. It really is just Bankbuster will cost 1 less, and Mishra's Research Desk will be essentially a free artifact that we can tap 1 and sacrifice it, exile type cards of our library, and choose one of them and put that into our hand. We have to play that card until the end of our next turn, and we play that card and we can unearth and do it all over again. This is definitely a fun list. I do enjoy the interaction that the Anvil decks have. I know it's not for everybody. It's definitely a deck that can grind out games. You have, unless your opponent has a lot of over-the-top trample and artifact removal, this is one of those decks that really grinds out games. It kind of, I would say, frustrates your opponent if they don't have a lot of good ways to deal with it. It's got a lot of good stuff. You have Voltage Surge is good spot removal. We have a lot of artifacts to sacrifice, so this is easily a 1 mana deal 4 damage to target creature and or planeswalker. We have Eat Alive as another spot removal spell that we can sacrifice a creature for 1 mana and exile target creature or planeswalker. Maybe we don't want something particular to come back. When it comes to looking at what you could possibly add into the deck when it comes to sideboard, depending on what your matchup is, what we do is we add in additional cutdowns. Cutdowns, if we're going against more aggressive decks, cutdowns very good because it gets rid of a lot of the more aggressive creatures in the format. Abrades here it's just a decent 2 mana, deal 3 damage to target creature, or 2 damage or 2 mana and we destroy target artifact. Liliana, if we want to make our opponent sacrifice creatures, hit their hand, make them discard spells. We have a lot of cards that have a lot of value and they're relatively on the cheaper side, so a lot of times we will have empty hands. If we play Liliana, this will allow us to put pressure on our opponent's hand, especially if they play a lot of expensive spells, making them have to discard key spells. Obnixilus is here, yet again, just like Liliana. This is another card that puts a lot of pressure. The benefit of this is that we can casualty sacrificing another creature, making a token that's a copy of Obnixilus, and then having essentially 2 Obnixiluses out. And then getting the benefit of all the abilities of Obnixilus twice. So we -2 probably this version, which would then create a 1/1 Devil. We can then +1 the token copy if we sacrifice a 1/1 token, making our opponent lose 2 life unless they discard a card. And if we control a demon or a devil, we gain 2 life, which is definitely very good. And if we get to -7, we can target player draw 7 cards and lose 7 life, which is, it's there, but it's not really the key thing. A lot of times it's just trying to get a devil out and then putting pressure on opponent's hand to the point that they can't lose life and they have to start discarding cards in their hand. Duress is also very good if you're going against a matchup where opponent's playing a lot of things that aren't creatures or lands. You can look at their hand, make them discard a non-creature, non-land card for 1 mana, which is definitely good. Additional Abrades. Unlicensed Hearse, yet again, if you got opponents playing some sort of reoccursion, Unlicensed Hearse is just a good way to start eating their graveyard, getting rid of those cards that come back from the graveyard by paying mana, or come back over and over again, like a Tenacious Underdog. Definitely overall very good. And then we also have Soul Transfer here, a card that actually works pretty well in this deck, in the sense that if we control an artifact and an enchantment, and as we cast a spell, we may choose both. If not, we exile target creature card or planeswalker, exile, and then return a creature or planeswalker card from our graveyard to our hands. We get to choose one, or we possibly get both, depending on what the matchup is. But overall, Grixis Anvil, it's a strong deck. It's definitely a good deck. Definitely, if you like Anvil, maybe Splash and Blue is definitely maybe the way to go if you are looking at a way to improve your Anvil deck, if you feel like your Anvil deck has gotten a little bit stale. Next deck up on the list is a deck that has just kind of existed in both metas, and that's going to be Mono Black Aggro. This is kind of one of those decks that has gotten better. It has gotten a lot of new cards with Brothers War, especially really good cards, depending on what your meta is. And it's definitely, a solid deck, solid curve, relatively on the cheaper side, but definitely has a lot of power for the lack of mana that you would say spend on this said creatures. And with Brothers War, we've gotten a lot of new tools that definitely help improve the deck overall. In the 2-drop slot, we have Razor Lash Transmogrant, 2 mana, 3/1 that it can't block. For 6 mana, we can turn it from our graveyard to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. This ability costs 4 less to cast if an opponent controls 4 more non-basic lands. So this is kind of like one of those unique cards because a lot of the meta is 3-color decks or multicolor decks in general. There's a good chance that you can actually cast this for 2 mana, which makes this a really good card to have, especially in a metagame that's very non-basic heavy. Overall, very good card for only 2 mana. Another card that is new from Brothers War is Transmogrant Crown. It's a 2 mana equipment that gives target creature +2/+0, and then whenever a equipped creature dies, we get to draw a card. Given any of our creatures that possibly maybe we want to attack aggressively, like a Tenacious Underdog, that additional 2 damage, possibly that it could deal, and then on top of it, when that creature dies, if your opponent decides to block it, because the Tenacious Underdog swinging in for 5 is definitely something they kind of have to deal with one way or the other, we're going to get to draw a card out of it. We do have Go for the Throat here, which is just kind of like a replacement for Infernal Grass, though I would say you could still play Infernal Grass if you feel like your metagame is very artifact heavy, as this doesn't destroy target creatures that are artifacts, so that's the one downside to it, but still 2 mana, destroy target creature and don't lose any life as long as it's not an artifact. Another card that's new from Brothers War is Misery Shadow, 2 mana, 2/2. If a creature opponent control will die, exile instead, making it better in the matchups where maybe your opponent has things that come back from the graveyard. Creature-wise, this is just going to exile them, and the fact that we can pay 1 mana and give a +1/+1 end of turn makes this card very strong in the sense that it doesn't cost a lot to really make it that much stronger, and we could put pressure on their opponent's life total relatively quickly. In the 3-drop slot, another card that got added in with Brothers War is Gix the Yawgmoth Predator, 3 mana, 3/3, that whenever it deals damage to one of our opponents, we pay 1 life. If we do, we get to draw a card. 7 mana, we discard X cards, exile top X cards of opponent's library. We may pay lands and cast spells among them with cards exiled this way, all paying their mana cost, making Gix a very good aggressive card for us, as this is going to be our tempo card. Meaning that we get a lot of threats on the battlefield, and if whatever our opponent doesn't block, we're going to get to possibly draw a card for each damage that we deal to our opponent's face. And then another card that got added with Brothers War is going to be the Phyrexian Fleshgorger. I think this is the first time I've mentioned it in today's video, but this is a 7-drop, 7/5 menace, lifelink, and ward. That the ward is pay the life equal to its power. And then it also has a prototype side, which means you can pay the cheaper side, and it comes into the battlefield as a 3/3 for 3 with menace and lifelink, and then the ward is 3 life that your opponent has to pay in order to remove it or target it with a spell directly, making this in both ways a very, very good card. You can play it early, you can play it late, depending on what the overall matchup is. But still, nonetheless, Mono Black Aggro is a deck to worry about in one way or the other, just because even though the deck is on the low side when it comes to overall casting costs, it has a solid curve. All the cards are relatively on the powerful side. So it is one of those decks that if you are someone who's playing it, you definitely know the power of when you hit the perfect curve. It definitely puts a lot of pressure on your opponent's life total very, very quickly. And then the last card that's in this deck is also Mistress Factory, a great card to have in a monocolor deck just because we're not really worried about fixing our mana for other colors. A land that produces colorless makes a 2/2 creature for 2 mana that allows us to attack him more aggressively, and it's still a land. And if we have multiples of these out, we can give a target attack and assembly worker, either meaning itself, if we have 2 of these out, additional +2/+2 and end of turn. When it comes to sideboarding, that's definitely one of those things, as we, have to sideboard against other decks in the meta. So in the sideboard, we have, an additional copy of Cut Down if our opponent's also playing an aggressive deck. It's always good to have 4 copies of, especially if it's a low to ground aggressive deck. Duress to hit the hand in case our opponent's playing more of the non-creature deck. We have spells to then target cards in their hand, especially key cards that we give us some sort of problems. Liliana is another solid card in the matchup just because it's a great card against maybe the more mid-range decks of the format, meaning that, for the -2, we sacrifice maybe the very few creatures they have out on the battlefield, and then we can start plussing and start discarding making our opponent discard cards. And at the same time, too, we discard cards, but we do have a lot of value to get those cards back, depending on what you shift out for Liliana. Sorin's another great card, another solid card. In this deck, just because it is a 4-mana planeswalker that has a +1 ability that we get to look at the top card of our library. We can reveal that card, add it to our hand. If we do, we would lose life equal to its mana value. So if it's a land, we lose 0. If it's like a cut down, we'll lose 1. So depending on what the card is, we'll lose life based on that. For -2, we can get a 2/3 vampire with lifelink, making it very hard for decks to attack in if their opponent doesn't want us to gain a bunch of life. And then -7, if we get there, it deals 13 damage to any target, and we lose 13 life. As well, in this deck, we have Bankbuster. Definitely a solid card. If we want to go a little bit more mid-range, if our opponent's maybe a little bit on the slower side, get more value. This is a great card for 2 mana. It allows us to draw a card, and then it has the possibility of becoming a creature. Unlicensed Hearse to hit the graveyard. Very solid option here, eating things out of the graveyard. If our opponent's also playing things that come back from the graveyard, this is definitely very good. And then we also have Malicious Malfunction, a 3 mana, give all creatures -2/2 and end of turn. If a creature would die this turn, exile instead. This is kind of one of those cards that if our opponent has a lot of tokens or something like that, or small creatures, yet again, a very good card. And on top of that, all those cards are exiled. It's definitely one of those things you can definitely tell. It's kind of like our temporary meat hook. As Mono Black can't play meat hook as it is banned in Standard, but still, nonetheless, it's a pretty decent card for 3 mana. It does a -2/2 overall. So the next deck up on the list is going to be Esper mid-range. Now, this is kind of similar to almost like Esper Legends, but this one's doing a little bit more of the mid-range stuff where it doesn't play a ton of creatures. A lot of the creatures that are in the deck are just like the best creatures, and it sets yourself up for that mid-turn part of the game, as you don't see any single 1-drop in the deck. And to be quite honest, this deck really doesn't get too much from Brothers War when it comes to any new cards. If you have been playing this deck, the only thing that you see maybe now in these decks are things like Go for the Throat instead of Infernal Grasp, because it is a better removal spell if a meta is not very heavy in artifact creatures, and for the fact that you don't lose any life in the process of removing a creature. This deck has a lot of disruption in the sense that it has Make Disappear. We have Destroy Evil, depending on what our matchup. Has things like Wandering Emperor against the more aggressive decks. Shieldred's a very strong card in this matchup just because of its ability of whenever we draw a card, we gain 2 life. Whenever our opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. Combine that with Rafine, making those cards together very, very strong overall. To be quite honest, this deck is very good. I just think the one thing it struggles from is that if your opponent has a good way to go over the top, that's going to be where we're going to struggle. If their creatures are stronger than ours before we really get our engine going, it's going to be definitely very challenging. But we do have a lot of ways to kind of deal with said creatures, so it is one of those things. It's just a matter of what the matchup is. A lot of times the problem with mid-range decks is that we kind of lose to the more heavy control decks. If you go up against something like an Azorius Control or Dimir Control or something like that, it will be very challenging if they have a lot of ways to interact or wipe the board out, like decks that play like Farewell. Anything that's going to get rid of creatures in big one fell swoop or get rid of graveyards, I would say Farewell is that option that kind of does a lot of the things. Outside of getting rid of planeswalkers, Farewell will hit most cards in this deck, and combine that with counter spells and counter magic, it's definitely going to be a little bit of a challenge. But nonetheless, against other mid-range decks and aggro decks of the format, this is definitely a solid option. And then look, when it comes to sideboard, this deck is going to be playing the typical things that you would see in these colors. We have the copies of Cut Down if our opponent's on the more aggressive side, Disdainful Stroke for the bigger over-the-top decks. Negate as well, getting rid of non-creature spells instead of like Make Disappears. You swap some of those out. Additional Go for the Throats if they're more aggressive. Additional copy Destroy Evil, whether they're more enchantment heavy or big creature heavy. Siphon Insight is a good card in the sense that we get to take things our opponent has, and then we get to cast that card, which is definitely very good if we think that our opponent's playing some high value cards that we maybe want to steal and play on our end. Void Ren's a very good removal card. Yet again, if you're playing against maybe the mirror matchup, Void Ren's definitely a good card to have in the sense that it can't be countered and destroys target not only a permanent for 3 mana. And then, of course, we are also playing our own farewells in the sideboard as a good way to deal with maybe the more aggressive decks of the format. The one downside, it will exile our things as well if we share the same things on both sides, but still, nonetheless, it's definitely a good card to have for 6 mana, just to kind of reset everything. Maybe you have decent value still in your hand, and you feel like if you use something like a farewell, it will kind of make your opponent fall behind dramatically if you can rebuild relatively quickly. Like I said, this deck is a very solid option. It sits very well in the meta. It hasn't needed to change to kind of adjust to the meta, and it's an overall very powerful deck. For the colors. And the last deck up on the list is going to be Grixis midrange. Now, we already had Grixis Anvil up, and this is kind of like Grixis, let me play the best cards that are currently exist in Magic and Standard overall. This is definitely a deck that also didn't really gain too many new cards from Brothers War. The only thing that they did was that they swapped out their Infernal Grasp for Go for the Throats. We also have cut downs in the deck, so that's a lot of spot removal. Like I said, this is the deck that plays a lot of things that are just very good in these colors for the meta. It probably plays the best card in the Fable of the Mirror Breaker because it is a 3 mana enchantment that we get as Goblin. We get to discard up to 2 cards. If we do, we draw that many cards. And then we get the Kiki Jiki, which allows us to copy things that we may have on our side of the battlefield and then sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step, which creates a lot of interesting, unique kind of things that we can do. One being like Corpse Appraiser, copying that, eating things from graveyards, allowing us to dig deeper in our deck if we need to and find a card or find an answer. Blood Tithe Harvester, getting additional blood tokens, sacrificing that token that we're copying with Kiki Jiki, giving target creature -X/-X, probably destroying it in the process, and then just doing that over and over again. Another new card from Brothers War, the only one that's really added into the deck, is the Phyrexian Fleshgorger, the 7 mana 7/5 prototype creature that is a 3/3, has menace, has lifelink, has ward of pain life equal to its power. So overall, this deck is very good, just like the last deck. This is another deck that has been in a very good position overall. If anything, it's just gotten a little bit better with some of the new additional cards that got introduced with Brothers War. But still, nonetheless, it's a solid deck from top to bottom. It just has a lot of good, powerful cards in the colors that we are currently playing it. And I'll be quite honest, I bet you 10-1, there's probably someone who's running this deck who's done very well with it overall. When it comes to sideboard, I mean, yet again, we're in these colors, so you see a lot of the same cards, whether additional copies of cards already in the deck or just cards that you just see in general that work well for the overall meta. You have cards like Cut Down, just adding that additional copies of the rest. Abrades here, just in case we need that additional way to deal 3 damage to creatures or get rid of additional artifacts. Brother's End is a great, removal card in the sense that it deals 3 damage to each creature and each planeswalker for only 3 mana. Very good against very low curve decks in that way. Also, if your opponent's very heavy into artifacts, you can destroy all our artifacts with mana value 3 or less, which is definitely very good, which gets rid of Power Stones as well. Additional copy of Sheoldred if we really want to make sure we hit that card, as she's just a very good card to just put in the way of very aggressive creatures. Torthbreach is here as it's just a, tap X. Depending on what the matchup is, it also can't be countered. It costs 2 less if it targets a blue permanent, so this is kind of like the mono blue tempo, mono blue like Esper type stuff. This is going to hit a lot of things in the meta in general. Bankbuster's here for additional value, add in 4 additional copies. Unlicensed Hearse to eat things from the graveyard, and then just additional copies of Brothers. And so, yet again, just like the last couple decks, a lot of these decks are decks that just kind of existed in the meta since rotation happened. And the only thing they really did was pick up a card or 2 here and there. But, this is definitely kind of one of those unique things. I want to check out the traditional meta. I may try to maybe play a little bit more best of 3 as I'm looking maybe to get back into playing, standard, at least physically. So I got to get some practice. So I might as well kind of go over the meta with you guys. But let me know in the comments below if you guys play any traditional Magic or are interested in possibly playing it. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. If you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely lets me know you guys maybe want to see more traditional content here on the channel. With that being said, if you're new here, you want to post new videos like this one here on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Just want to give a special shout out to the channel members here on my YouTube channel. You can also become a channel member yourself down below the video, hitting that join button. It definitely helps out a lot, and I just appreciate you guys for your support.